1941. The world trembled under the weight of war, and every nation scrambled to forge the perfect machine of the skies. Engines roared over muddy airfields. Mechanics worked with frozen fingers. Pilots, many barely out of their teens, trained in aircraft that were supposed to keep them alive in a sky filled with hunters. But hidden in the shadows of this global arms race was a machine so deeply flawed, so painfully underdeveloped, that even its own crews whispered about it with a mix of embarrassment and dread. It sat alone on the tarmac at dawn, its metal skin rattling when the winter wind scraped across its uneven panels. The ground crew didn't admire it, they pitied it. And the pilots, they climbed into its cramped cockpit knowing full well that this fighter wasn't built to protect them. It was built to hope the enemy didn't notice them. On paper, it was meant to be the nation's proud answer to aerial domination. In reality, it became the punchline of battlefield hangars, a fragile creation with an engine that sputtered when pushed and wings that trembled under their own weight. As the world advanced toward faster, stronger, deadlier machines, this unfortunate warplane lagged behind like a wounded animal on a battlefield that demanded predators. And yet, this aircraft still flew. Not because it was ready, never because it was ready, but because the world had run out of time. Every takeoff felt like a gamble. Every landing felt like a prayer answered. This is the story of a fighter that history nearly forgot, because those who flew it wished they could forget it themselves. The most pathetic fighter of World War II wasn't just a failure of engineering. It was a tragedy of desperation, design, and the brutal truth of war. The tragedy began long before the aircraft ever touched the sky, long before any pilot sat inside its cramped cockpit and prayed its trembling frame would hold together. It began in a dimly lit office where a handful of exhausted engineers stared at blank sheets of parchment, pencils trembling in their hands, knowing the future of their country's air defense depended on lines they hadn't even drawn yet. The year was filled with pressure. Pressure from military commanders demanding something that could fly by tomorrow morning, pressure from governments desperate for a miracle, and pressure from a war machine that was expanding faster than anyone could comprehend. Every day, reports arrived describing the enemy's latest high-performance fighters, faster, stronger, built with resources and industrial power that seemed endless. And so, with barely functioning machines around them and outdated tools scattered across their desks, the designers were told to do the impossible, create a cutting-edge fighter in a fraction of the time normally required to build even a basic trainer. The first sketches betrayed the desperation of their creators. The outline of the fuselage looked sharp at a glance, but when examined closer, its proportions didn't make sense. The engine was too small for the weight it was meant to carry. The wings, though sleek in drawing, were shaped more for stability than agility, an unforgivable flaw for a frontline fighter. Yet the men designing it had no choice. They were instructed to build using whatever metal their factories still had on hand, even if the alloys weren't suitable for the stresses of combat. Rivets that should have been made of hardened steel were replaced with softer, cheaper alternatives. Components that should have been cast or forged were instead stamped crudely to save time. The aircraft, even before construction began, was sentenced to weakness. When the prototype finally rolled out of the hangar, the optimism lasted only seconds. Workers who had spent months wrestling mismatched components into place stepped back and looked at the machine with a quiet, uncomfortable hesitation. From a distance, it resembled a modern fighter, sleek nose, streamlined canopy, compact frame. But the closer one walked, the more the truth bled through. The metal panels didn't sit flush, some bulged slightly where they had been forced into alignment. The landing gear, borrowed from an older aircraft, looked thin and fragile under the fighter's weight. The propeller blades were slightly uneven due to manufacturing inconsistencies, something the factory couldn't afford to fix. But the worst suspicion lay in the engine housing. What should have held a powerful, fire-breathing engine capable of ripping the fighter into the sky instead held an underpowered unit originally designed for training aircraft, not fast, not durable, and certainly not ready for combat. The engineers knew the engine was a mistake, but command insisted it was temporary, a placeholder until newer, stronger engines arrived. Those engines never came. Production delays, supply shortages, and political interference ensured that this fighter was shackled to the wrong heart from the beginning. As the mechanics removed the panels for inspection, they found the engine mount vibrating visibly even while idle. When the throttle was pushed forward, the entire aircraft shuddered with concerning intensity, as if resisting its own purpose. Test pilots standing nearby exchanged worried glances. Nothing good could come from flying a machine that shook itself apart just warming up. Yet orders were orders. The aircraft would fly that morning. A test pilot, chosen mostly for his willingness rather than his experience, climbed into the cockpit. He sat down, lowered himself into the narrow seat, and instantly felt how confined it was. The controls were cramped together, barely spaced, placed without care for ergonomics. The cockpit canopy rattled when he pulled it shut. The gauges flickered from the moment the engine fired up, a sign that the wiring, likely rushed under pressure, was unreliable. The smell of raw fuel seeped into the cabin, mixing with the metallic scent of new but poorly treated aluminum. Still, he signaled readiness. There was no time to fix anything. The aircraft crawled down the runway at a sluggish pace. Mechanics watched, some holding their breath, some shaking their heads. They had seen better takeoff runs from cargo planes twice its weight. The pilot eased the throttle further, and the engine coughed like an old generator forced beyond its limits. The propeller spun faster, but not fast enough. The fighter inched forward, shaking violently, as if each bolt was fighting to remain attached. Finally, the wheels lifted, barely. The aircraft staggered into the sky like a drunken, wounded bird unsure of its own wings. It gained altitude with visible struggle, and even from the ground, the instability was obvious. The wings quivered, bending at their weakest points, their internal supports not strong enough for sustained stress. The tail section wobbled unpredictably, reacting late to rudder inputs. Up in the air, the pilot realized immediately that the aircraft wasn't only underpowered, it was aerodynamically confused. The nose dipped randomly, forcing him to tug the stick just to maintain level flight. The stall speed was dangerously high, meaning any attempt to maneuver sharply would cause the aircraft to drop like a stone. The roll rate was sluggish, unresponsive, almost lazy. The climb rate was pathetic, barely half that of enemy fighters already dominating the skies. This wasn't a predator. It wasn't even a competitor. It was prey disguised as a fighter plane. When the pilot attempted a simple banking turn, the aircraft lurched violently, the right wing dipping far more than expected. The cockpit vibrated so intensely that the instruments blurred. It felt, the pilot later wrote, as if the airplane wanted to tear itself apart for daring to leave the ground. After only a few minutes in the air, he knew the truth that no engineer wanted to say aloud. This aircraft wasn't fit for combat. It wasn't even fit for training. It was an accident waiting to happen, a mechanical tragedy built from desperation, shortcuts, and wishful thinking. The landing was just as terrifying. The moment the pilot reduced throttle, the engine sputtered as though relieved. The landing gear, weak and poorly aligned, barely absorbed the impact of touchdown. When the plane rolled to a stop, one of the mechanics whispered, "It's a miracle it came back." But war doesn't wait for perfection. The aircraft was approved for production anyway. The military needed fighters, any fighters, with wings and a gun, no matter how pitiful. The factory workers continued building what they knew was flawed, because the alternative was sending pilots into battle with nothing at all. And so the most pathetic fighter of World War II was born not from incompetence alone, but from a world forced into impossible decisions under the crushing weight of conflict. When the aircraft was finally pushed into real combat service, its weaknesses transformed from embarrassing design flaws into lethal liabilities. Pilots wrote in their diaries that flying it felt less like taking a machine into war and more like stepping into a coffin with wings. From the moment the engine sputtered to life on a cold morning, they could hear the rattle of unsecured panels, the groan of poorly aligned control surfaces, and the unstable whine of an engine never meant to face the violent demands of aerial warfare. Even on the ground, while taxiing toward the runway, the aircraft vibrated as though bracing itself for a fate it knew it could not survive. Every pilot walking toward it felt the same weight on their shoulders. This wasn't a fighter built to win battles, it was a machine built to hope the enemy never found it. The moment it left the earth, its flaws revealed themselves with cruel honesty. Instead of climbing with confident power, it clawed weakly at the sky, struggling to gain altitude. The pilot had to pull back on the stick harder than expected, fighting the aircraft's reluctance to ascend. The engine groaned under the strain, its limited horsepower insufficient to lift the aircraft quickly enough to escape ground fire or to reach cruising altitude before enemy patrols spotted it. Ground crews watching from below could see how sluggish it looked, how slowly the propeller bit into the air, how the fighter floated rather than flew with purpose. Even from a distance, you could tell this aircraft was terrified of the sky it was meant to conquer. The moment it reached operational height, the real panic set in. Enemy fighters, built with superior engines and refined aerodynamics, cut through the sky like blades. They dove with grace, climbed like rockets, turned with frightening tightness. On the other hand, the pathetic fighter struggled to maintain even a straight, stable flight path. A slight breeze could unsettle it. A mild turn could drain its speed. The wings shuddered violently in even gentle maneuvers, as though the aircraft's very skeleton objected to being stressed. Pilots reported that barrel rolls were nearly impossible. Attempting one often resulted in the aircraft losing precious altitude or stalling altogether. It wasn't a fighter. They were flying a trembling metal compromise. And then came the dogfights. Every pilot dreaded the moment enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon. Other fighters of that era might feel adrenaline, even excitement, at the sight of combat. But pilots of this machine felt fear, raw, cold, numbing fear. They knew they didn't stand a chance in a turning engagement. If an enemy fighter locked onto their tail, escaping was nearly impossible. The pathetic fighter lacked acceleration. Its engine simply didn't have the strength to push the aircraft to competitive speeds. Worse, its structure could not withstand high-G maneuvers. If the pilot tried to dive to gain speed, the wings shook violently, the fuselage rattling like a bucket of loose bolts. Some pilots reported hearing the metal creak under pressure. The aircraft wanted to fall apart long before it wanted to win a fight. In steep dives, the vibration was so extreme that many instruments became unreadable. Needles bounced erratically, gauges flickered, and the canopy rattled loudly enough to drown out radio communication. The control stick shook in the pilot's hand, requiring constant correction to keep the aircraft from rolling uncontrollably. The tail section responded slowly, always a fraction of a second too late, as if the aircraft was operating on a delayed instinct. The pilot was fighting not just an enemy force in the sky, but the aircraft itself. During climbs, the experience was equally humiliating. When enemy planes soared upward with powerful, confident thrust, this fighter crawled upward like a wounded animal. Pilots reported that climbing felt like dragging the aircraft against its will. The nose lifted, but the frame sagged. The engine temperature spiked dangerously, often forcing pilots to reduce throttle mid-climb, killing what little speed they had managed to build. In some cases, the aircraft could not climb fast enough to clear terrain, forcing pilots to circle awkwardly, losing time and fuel, just to gain the altitude other fighters reached in seconds. Turning battles were the worst. The aircraft exhibited massive energy loss in banked turns. Even a shallow turn could bleed speed rapidly, making escape impossible. If a pilot tried to tighten the turn, the aircraft groaned, the wings warped slightly under pressure, and the speed dropped to near stall levels. One pilot wrote, "Turning this aircraft in combat felt like dragging a plow through mud while the enemy flew circles around me." Another pilot described the experience as being trapped inside a dying machine that begged me not to maneuver. Enemy fighters quickly learned that this aircraft was easy prey. They began targeting it with confidence, knowing it couldn't outrun, outclimb, or outmaneuver them. Reports from surviving pilots describe moments when they saw shadows pass over their canopy, the unmistakable silhouette of a superior enemy plane swooping down. Panic surged instantly. They pushed the throttle forward, but the throttle offered no mercy. The engine coughed, the propeller strained, and the fighter crawled forward while death approached with effortless, terrifying speed. Many pilots didn't even attempt to dogfight. They simply tried to survive long enough to return home. The cockpit added to the nightmare. The cramped interior amplified every vibration. When the aircraft shook, the entire cockpit seemed to buzz like an angry wasp trapped inside a tin can. The pilot's seat vibrated so violently during dives that some reported numbness afterward. The instrument panel rattled, screws loosening mid-flight. The canopy occasionally fogged from temperature inconsistencies caused by the engine's irregular heat output. Even the oxygen system malfunctioned at higher altitudes due to poor airflow design. Everything about the cockpit reminded pilots they were flying a machine unfit for war. The radio often crackled or failed entirely. Communication during combat was unreliable, leaving pilots isolated in the terrifying chaos. Many entered battle knowing that if trouble came, and it always came, they would be alone. No reinforcements, no wingmen, no coordination. Just them and a machine barely holding itself together. Despite these failures, despite every sign that this aircraft was doomed the moment it entered combat, pilots continued to fly it. They took to the skies every morning because they had no other choice. Their courage was real, the fighters' competence was not. Aircraft losses were frequent and painful. Squadrons equipped with this fighter were often decimated within weeks. Commanders tried to hide the statistics to maintain morale, but pilots knew the truth. They saw empty bunks, abandoned flight jackets, and the haunting silence in the mess hall where once laughing voices had filled the air. Over time, pilots developed their own survival tactics. They avoided engagements whenever possible. They flew low to the ground, hoping terrain masking would shield them. They performed gentle turns instead of sharp ones. They avoided climbing battles, knowing they would lose immediately. One pilot described his combat strategy as fighting with the instincts of prey, never a predator. Another wrote, "My goal was not to win the battle, it was simply to make it home alive." But even with strategies, survival was never guaranteed. The aircraft was so fragile that even minor damage could send it spiraling out of control. A single burst of machine gun fire from an enemy fighter could shear through its thin skin, compromise its already weak structure, or puncture its underpowered engine. A lucky hit could save an enemy pilot ammunition. The aircraft did most of the falling apart on its own. And yet, pilots still fought. They climbed into their trembling machines every dawn, strapped in, and tried to convince themselves the aircraft would last one more mission. Their bravery contrasted violently with the machine beneath them, a plane incapable of matching their courage. And though many of these pilots did not survive the war, the memory of their struggle lives on, as a reminder of what happens when flawed engineering meets unforgiving skies. By the midpoint of the war, the aircraft's fate had become painfully clear to everyone who had ever touched it: pilots, mechanics, commanders, even the workers who riveted its fragile skin. What had once been presented as a symbol of national hope had quietly transformed into a source of frustration, embarrassment, and whispered resentment. The people forced to rely on it did not hate it. Hatred required the machine to have betrayed them. Instead, they pitied it, as one might pity a wounded animal dragged into a battlefield it never belonged on. It had been born weak, pushed too hard, and abandoned long before it could ever redeem itself. And so, without ceremony, it slowly disappeared from frontline service, replaced by aircraft that at least had a fighting chance. In many squadrons, the removal felt like relief. Pilots who had flown the aircraft through storms, enemy territory, and mechanical chaos finally saw it towed away for the last time. Some watched the process with quiet gratitude, others with a lingering sadness. The aircraft had failed them, yes, but they also understood it had been asked to do something it was never designed for. No amount of resentment could erase the fact that both the machine and the men who flew it had been victims of the same desperation. For some, retirement felt like finally letting a dying soldier rest. In the corner of one airfield after another, rows of damaged aircraft were rolled behind hangars where the sunlight rarely reached. Ground crews scavenged them for anything useful: a surviving fuel pump, a handful of intact bolts, maybe a panel that hadn't yet warped from stress. Sometimes the entire nose section of one aircraft would be removed and bolted onto another in a desperate attempt to keep at least a few airframes flying for training or patrol duty. The plane had been reduced to a donor body, stripped for organs so that stronger machines might live. This cannibalization wasn't done out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Every part taken from the failing fighter felt like one more piece of the war effort being salvaged from a mistake. Over time, the abandoned fighters began to take on a ghostly presence in the landscape. Some were wheeled to the edges of runways and left there, slowly sinking into mud softened by constant rain. Others were moved to overgrown fields behind storage sheds, hidden behind stacks of spare tires and crates filled with broken tools. Wild grass crawled up their landing gear. Moss clung to their wings. Rust crept along their fuselage like an infection. They no longer looked like warplanes. They looked like forgotten artifacts of a failure everyone wanted to leave behind. And yet, the aircraft never fully disappeared. Even stripped and silent, it lingered in the minds of those who had trusted it with their lives. Pilots who survived their time with it remembered the terrifying moments when the wings shook during dives, when the engine nearly stalled in mid-climb, when enemy fighters descended from above and they realized, again, that the aircraft could not outrun anything. Mechanics recalled nights spent working under dim lantern light, hands numb from cold, trying to coax life out of an engine that hated being alive. They remembered the guilt they felt every time a pilot took off, knowing how fragile the machine truly was. The worst memories belonged to the pilots who never returned. Their comrades often stared at the empty spaces in the barracks, knowing deep down that many of those deaths might have been prevented had they been given a better aircraft. Commanders wrote letters to grieving families, carefully avoiding words that might reveal the truth. They spoke of courage, they spoke of sacrifice, but they never spoke of the reality that some of those brave young men had gone into battle with a machine that could not protect them. In time, the aircraft's reputation grew into something almost mythical within the ranks. It became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong during those desperate years: poor planning, rushed decisions, lack of resources, and blind faith in flawed machines. Pilots joked about it darkly, calling it names that no military report ever recorded. Mechanics referred to it as the rattletrap, the reluctant eagle, the sky's mistake. But behind the humor was a deep, quiet pain. They joked because they couldn't bear to speak the truth. The machine had taken lives not out of malice, but because it simply wasn't strong enough to save them. In a world consumed by conflict, where innovation happened at lightning speed, the aircraft was swiftly overshadowed by newer, smarter, more capable designs. Other fighters entered service with stronger engines, reinforced airframes, and aerodynamic shapes that could dance through the sky with grace. Compared to them, the pathetic fighter from earlier in the war looked like a relic from another era, an embarrassing reminder of a time when desperation outran wisdom. Some nations attempted to repurpose the aircraft for things safer than combat, training new pilots, towing gliders, performing simple reconnaissance runs far from the front lines. But even in these roles, its flaws followed it like a curse. Its engine overheated too quickly for long training sessions. Its vibration made it difficult for new pilots to develop steady control. Its weak frame made towing nearly impossible. Eventually, even these secondary roles were taken from it. A few airfields tried to use the aircraft as decoys, placing them at the edges of runways to confuse enemy observers. But even enemy reconnaissance pilots realized quickly that these aircraft weren't worth bombing. They posed no threat, not even as illusions. By the final years of the war, the aircraft had disappeared almost entirely from operational records. New recruits didn't even know its name. It became a rumor, a ghost story older pilots told to emphasize how far aviation had come in such a short time. Some spoke of it with disdain, others, with strange affection. A few even felt guilty for surviving flights in a machine that others hadn't lived to tell about. But no matter how people remembered it, everyone agreed on one thing: the aircraft had never truly belonged in the sky. Yet the ghost of the aircraft lived on. Engineers studying wartime mistakes often used it as a case study, not to shame the designers, but to illustrate the consequences of rushing creation in a moment of crisis. Aviation historians noted that the aircraft's tragic existence was not the fault of one engineer or one decision, but the inevitable result of a nation grappling with overwhelming pressure. Even decades later, preserved fragments of the aircraft would be found in barns, forgotten hangars, or remote airfields where time moved slower than history. Rusted wings, cracked cockpit glass, broken propellers, all relics of a machine that tried, and failed, to serve a purpose too big for its fragile frame. Standing next to one of these surviving wrecks today, even as nothing more than corroded metal and silent bones, one cannot help but feel a strange mixture of sorrow and respect. It didn't choose to be the most pathetic fighter of World War II. It didn't choose to fail. It was built by hands doing their best under impossible circumstances. It flew because pilots had no alternative. It fought because war demanded sacrifice, from machines and men alike. And though history rarely speaks its name, the truth remains: this aircraft represents the forgotten costs of war, not just in battles lost, but in machines that were never given a fair chance to succeed. Its legacy is not one of glory, nor of triumph, but of resilience in the face of hopeless design. It stands, even now, as a testament to what happens when courage is forced into a machine unworthy of carrying it. And though time has buried it beneath stronger aircraft, victorious squadrons, and famous battles, its story echoes quietly across the decades, a reminder that even the weakest, most fragile creations have their own place in the vast and tragic tapestry of war.